Everybody hear me? Okay. Well, let me say it's a pleasure for both of us to be here. And what wasn't pointed out in that great introduction was that I actually worked for Judge Webster for 4 years. He was my boss. So it's really neat to be able to come back like this and to sit with my former boss where he can't give me any orders to do anything. He was a terrific boss, by the way. But I thought that we would start tonight. We were having a conversation the other day, the judge and I, about Washington University, and I thought before we get into the very weighty issues of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. national security, just to say something about Washington University, because the judge covers almost 60 plus years, I guess, of experience with the university, and I have 40. And as we were talking, I remembered back in the 1970s, and I started in 1970 in the graduate program, and that was a period of transition when Thomas Elliott was leaving the position, and the new chancellor was to be decided. But I was in an environment where I could look back on what Elliott had done, and he had been a congressman in Massachusetts, connected to the original Elliott family that established the university, a very distinguished man. My only personal experiences with him was when he yelled at me for crossing Clayton Road without the traffic, or against the traffic. So I had a personal relationship with him. But he had done, and it's always important, because I think we tend to think that everything good happens when our generation takes over. But my impression was that he had done a very good job, really, in improving the quality of the faculty and sort of designing the infrastructure of the university to expand, to grow, and to become more than a regional university. And by the way, it had a very good reputation as a regional university when I attended. But when Bill Danforth took over, there was this was Act Two of the tremendous commitment of the leadership of that university to build this into a first-rate university such as it is today. And then we can look at Mark Wrighton's period, of course, as a period of a huge investment in the infrastructure. I made the mistake knowing that Mark is a really quantificating kind of guy. And when he came to Washington, I told him I had been out to speak to a group that the business school asked me to address, and I said that in that address that since I left in 1977 the university with my doctorate, the university had built at least 30 new buildings, and Mark Wrighton very quickly said, right off the top of his head, "No, it's 50 built." And so you've seen tremendous expansion of that infrastructure, but also continued emphasis on getting the best faculty that university can have. When I was there, there used to be almost a bumper sticker that went on the back of a car that said, "Washington University is the Harvard of the Midwest." Harvard didn't believe that, and we were to some degree kidding ourselves. We were good, but not as good as we thought we were. But there's no question that in the years since I left, the progression that really began in the Elliott period has proceeded to where Washington University is a global university now of global stature, doing first-line, first-rate research in critical areas across the disciplines in a way that should make all of us proud. And that's why for us, with all the experience we've had in university, to know what it's become and to know what some of the younger people here represent in terms of the education you got and what you're doing with it, makes this a very satisfying experience. So I hope tonight, first of all, we're going to try to give you, this is Washington, but we're going to try to give you a civil conversation between two people, even when we disagree. It will be civil, an environment of mutual respect and a recognition that sometimes the other guy has something to say that's worth hearing, and that none of us has a corner on the truth. And I think that's the kind of education I got at Washington University. And I, by the way, came from Vietnam as a Vietnam vet to the university, and the university gave me a tremendous opportunity to get an education that was formative for me in every way. That everything that happened to me thereafter was because of the investment that university made me in giving me a fellowship at a critical time in my life when I would not have been able to otherwise have the educational experience that I did at that university. So I am spending, hopefully, my later years in wanting to give back to a university that gave to me in a way that made such a huge difference for my life and the life that I've led with the impact on other people. So for me, Washington University, it's a personal commitment, it's a personal admiration, it's a labor of love now to be able to give back to the university. And you might want to have something to say. You probably have more to say about, you've had a longer look at the place than I have.
First, let me start by saying, can you hear me? Because I'm not sure of these things, whether or not I know how to work them. Well, I think John has set the stage for an interesting discussion about some of the things that have involved us and the risks that are out there in the world today. Dan's is performing a unique function, I think, and getting national recognition for the kind of productive work that even graduates can provide for the public and are providing it. Just to shorten my own experience, I was a freshman at Amherst when the war broke out, and it wasn't too long before I got called up and went into the Navy as a naval officer. And when I got out of the Navy, I was about ready to graduate, and I did. And I chose to go to Washington University Law School, which worked out beautifully for me. And ever since then, my association has been primarily with WashU. I've been privileged to serve for a number of years as chair of the regional cabinet here in Washington. And many of you have worked with me in putting on programs and gatherings, and I want to say how much I appreciate all the cooperation that you gave me. I found that the whole evolution of Washington University's place in the scheme of things has been interesting to follow. I've been a partner for over 25 years, retired now from a law firm headquartered in New York. And I discovered I would get calls from partners in Singapore and faraway places saying, my daughter wants to go to WashU, can you help get her in? And most of the time I help, but I have to be realistic with them, and I'm sure you've heard these stories before, but I'd say, look, I can make sure they read your resumes and study the background of the candidates very carefully, but you have to understand that the freshman class has a class roll of about 1,500 people, and currently the number of applications for that opening is 30,000. So that tells you something. If you're a graduate of university and your children are involved with university, you're with a great place to be, because something is very right about Washington University. I remember when Bill Danforth finished up his tenure, and we were looking on the search committee for a new chancellor. I had a call from the outgoing chairman of the board saying, you know, I have an idea. Suppose I resign as chairman of the board and we put Bill Danforth in as chairman. How do you think the new chancellor would feel about something like that? Well, Bill Danforth had been there, 24 years? I said, well, my guess is, I said, there's a certain risk associated with it, depends on who you're talking to. But I would think that a thoughtful chancellor would relish the opportunity to have somebody of Bill Danforth's character and experience and judgment backing him up as chairman of the board. And he decided to do this, and he did it. And Bill Danforth was pleased to have that opportunity, and the candidate, who happened to be Mark Wrightson, was thrilled with the idea that he would have someone like Bill Danforth giving him support. And it worked out, I think, beautifully ever since. we could talk about WashU, but you didn't come to hear, I think, about WashU so much. We do want to get on to whatever we're doing. These are challenging times and interesting issues coming before all of us as citizens and our children who are maybe in school, to see how we measure up to the challenges that are ahead and take advantage of the unique experience that being involved with Washington University has meant to each of us. I should mention, I even taught a course in negotiable instruments while they were still teaching that course. Now they're teaching on uniform commercial code, but I always felt close to the university, and I've never more so than I do today. How we approach some of these issues, we try to say, how can we be useful here in Washington? You know, if you read the newspapers here in Washington, you know there's not always a whole lot of agreement about what's going on and how to judge the quality of candidates for high office, depending on accusations and fact, none of which we know for sure what's going on. When we're set out to deal with some very real threats, potential threats in this country to our citizens and to our country. Well, with that, I'm going to throw it back to John, who has his ideas on how to run this program.
Sure. Well, I think it might be good to, because we're going to, in the Q&A section, I'm sure we'll get a lot of questions about what's going on today, and we'll be happy to field those questions, feeling lucky that we're not actually in the saddle today to have to deal with them, but we have some people who actually in the audience who are taking them on. But I thought it would be useful to go back to a very challenging period in my own career when, in the 1980s, when the intelligence community and law enforcement, both CIA and FBI, had gone through a very difficult period with regard to the Church Pike hearings in 1976, which made a lot of accusations against both agencies, against FBI for what was called the Co-Intel program, the counterintelligence program, which was perceived to have violated the civil liberties of U.S. citizens, and then CIA, of course, for its activities abroad, which were very controversial. And Bill Colby, under a tremendous amount of stress in his day to deal with the congressional pressure. As a result, one of the good results of all of that period was that the committees were established oversight committees, both the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence were established to monitor the intelligence community, and including FBI, in a way that actually ended up supporting them in the good things they needed to do with a lot of change in the world that was taking place. But in 1978, first of all, right at the end, in this period, President Jimmy Carter made a decision that we needed a new FBI director who could kind of clean it up, could get beyond the controversy and restore the FBI to policies that adhered to the rule of law. And I want to when I speak to the judge about his commitment to the rule of law, which is bedrock and almost spiritual in his case, and it really has, I think, defined, the terrific career that he has had. But he was assigned, and this is what it's important to understand, he was assigned to take on a very difficult job of restoring not only the internal morale and commitment of the FBI to the rule of law and to the Constitution of the United States, but also to restore the public confidence and trust in that institution. He might have lasted for 10 years, and I think he probably would have loved to have made that 10-year mark, but along comes, and of course this is a Democratic president who has appointed him, a Republican president, Ronald Reagan decided, and this is at the end of a very difficult period with the Iran-Contra scandal that many of you would certainly remember vividly. And that, of course, that had a tremendously negative effect on morale at CIA, because our director and others associated with the agency were implicated in the charges made with regard to Iran-Contra. So Ronald Reagan, in a burst of insight and brilliance, decided what we need is somebody to get in there and to restore the confidence of that institution. And of course, Bill Casey had resigned and died in 1987, and that is sort of 9 years, not the 10 years that Judge Webster wanted at the FBI, but 9 years after his very successful tenure of restoring confidence in that institution, was then asked to come to to CIA and do the same thing. And of course, easy to say, to come from FBI, which is a very different, it's a basically law enforcement culture, to CIA, which operates abroad under very different kinds of rule, was a challenge. But I can tell you, as somebody who lived in that period and lived under his leadership, he was an inspired leader who left 4 years after his tenure at CIA, left the organization with a tremendous sense of mission forward and very high morale. And again, his emphasis on rule of law. You know, FBI has to be concerned about rule of law, period, within the United States. CIA worries less about rule of law abroad, but it does have to worry, and it does have to have leadership that is committed to rule of law within the United States and a commitment to our Constitution. And that was, I think, the mark that Judge Webster left on the place after his 4 years. But the final thing I'll say, and this is not a speech about Judge Webster, but I want him to comment on how he did it, how he got through it, because those of us who were under him at the time, we were so inspired by his leadership. But I'm sure every day was not an easy time for him. But here's the real kicker, that he comes to CIA. I mean, this is an agency that has responsibilities abroad, and for 40 plus years we've been dealing with the threat of the Soviet Union. And whammo, 2 years into the job comes 1989, when suddenly in Poland we discover that the Solidarity movement is actually challenging the communist government in a way that we never would have believed possible. And it ends up with Mikhail Gorbachev, the head of the Soviet government, actually advising the communist government to go into opposition if it couldn't. That was so unheard of. So we saw a process unfold from going from Poland, then to Hungary, then to Czechoslovakia, and then to East Germany, which was the linchpin of Soviet security in Europe. It collapses, and then on to Ceausescu's Romania, which we never thought, and nor did anybody in the region think this was going to happen. And it was partly because Gorbachev refused to use the Soviet system to defend these illegitimate systems. But here is our director, who now is in charge of a CIA, which its mission has been turned upside down, and he had to do something about it. Now, I will stop by simply saying what he did about it was lead the CIA in a way, listening to the leaders who knew it, who had vision and knew what that we needed to do, and frankly not listening to those who didn't have vision and telling us what we didn't surely need to do. And then actually working with the services, the intelligence services of those countries where the governments had fallen, and made decisions about who in those services could work with us and who couldn't, so that we actually created a very stable transition in that area. So I'm going to stop there, but the question for you, Judge, is very easy. How'd you do it?
Well, you give me credit for doing what I may not actually have done, but I will tell you how I tried to do it and how I think we had some successes. There are a lot of differences within these very important organizations that are dear to American heart about how much and how little you ought to do. At the point, I'd want to jump back to the time when I was approached by Judge Griffin Bell, who was then Attorney General, to take over the FBI. And it took me several months to realize, by doing some private sleuthing and sneaking off to the library to find out what was going wrong here, that it was too important an organization not to be taken seriously. And I've never regretted moving over to the FBI for another 9 years. And the problems that we were confronting, we were running into things called black bag jobs and other things of that kind that led a lot of Americans and journalists to think that maybe we weren't all that interested in following the law. And I think we're going to be talking a lot about the rule of law tonight, because it had so many different interpretations of what and how much and what do you do about protecting it. And when I was sworn in, the president came, the vice president, the chief justice swore me in as a great effort to give the FBI a boost from the federal government and from federal officials. And I wondered at one point, they were reaching around for I looked at Bell was patting his chest and was looking for a badge to give me as a new director of the FBI, and I was sort of amused at all of that. And I promised it would be just as bright and shiny 10 years later as it was. They were giving it to me that day. But I thought, what message can I send now? And then it came to me and I gave it to them. I said, I pledge myself and all who work with me that we will do the work that the American people expect of us. We'll do it. And we'll do it in the way that the Constitution demands of us. That's a quick summary of my interpretation of the rule of law. The rule of law is not, as Gorbachev thought, obeying the rules that are put out. The rule of law has much more to it. And respect for the rule of law and how you conduct your dealings with American citizens and with others has everything to do with the kind of success that you're going to have down the road in keeping our democracy preserved the way it is. And the takeaway on that is that years later, the FBI named the conference center at the current headquarters. Lord knows how long it'll be there, but its current headquarters for me. And they posted on the outside entrance to that door a picture of a very young Bill Webster, but the quotation was wrapped around that. I didn't realize that it had registered with the men and women in the FBI. We will do the work the American people expect of us in the way that the Constitution demands of us. And that's going to be, I think, part of our discussion this afternoon, and maybe some of your questions about how we behave in dealing with making decisions on what we do and what we don't do, and how we do it in a way that preserves the Constitution under a rule of law. And I can't underestimate the importance of that feeling. And when you're sitting there at CIA or FBI and trying to make decisions, whether it's that or one of the other fancy things that we sometimes have to do, we apply that test to it. And we can do the work the American people expect of us, but we will not have them saying, but you're not doing it as the Constitution demands. So that's what we'll be talking about.
Very good. Judge, well, first of all, I have to say that I had the experience just 2 years ago of living in the FBI for 14 months as the executive director for a congressionally directed commission on the performance of the FBI. So I got to appreciate more than I ever have the extent to which CIA agents really are trained in a commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law. And of course they live right across the street from the DOJ, which does not hesitate to layer on very specific requirements about what FBI can do in criminal investigation and intelligence gathering with regard to U.S. citizens in this country. And of course I came away from that experience believing this is very good for the Republic. This is just, I think, what we should want. CIA is very, so you went to CIA and then you encounter officers who are working abroad. They are not constrained by the U.S. Constitution. They are not constrained by the civil liberties of the countries that they're living in. They are asked to get information that's going to serve U.S. interests. But it requires, at times, I would think, a discipline on those people to make sure that, first of all, that while foreign law may be a secondary or tertiary issue, adherence to U.S. law and the U.S. Constitution has to be absolutely clear. So could you tell us a little bit about your experience with meeting this new crowd of overeager sometimes?
Sure, I'll talk about that because when the president asked me to go over to CIA, they were being confronted with a major scandal called the Iran-Contra problem, which had to do with arms for hostages and what people were saying about it and what was true and what was not true. And I don't know that he asked me to go over there because of that, because he was very loyal to CIA and very appreciative, thought they were doing a great job. But there was this problem of public trust. And I have to be candid about it. We had some cowboys at high levels at CIA at that time who did not have the same reverence for the rule of law concept because of what they were doing, dangerous activity abroad, but some of it was floating back into the United States, and we had to deal with it. And I had some very trenchant discussions with them, these cowboys, who were highly respected because they had done courageous things. But I'd get the argument, well, everything we do in this organization is illegal. Why are we worrying about something like that? And I said, no, that's not quite correct. It's true that we have a responsibility to collect intelligence, and it's also known as espionage in other parts of the world. And espionage is illegal in every country in the world that has anything to do with governing their procedures. So I grant you that, but when we get to the United States, we are bound by the Constitution and guided by the Constitution. And I said, we have to learn how to deal with that and make that shift in our thinking. And it wasn't always easy. Some of it was, and some were still unconvinced, but mostly I thought we had gotten the message across and everyone got on board to see what we could do to be sure that we were taking advice from our lawyers. We brought the lawyers back in who had been banished to other parts of the city, and brought them in back in where people had access to the legal advice that they needed and could have and use. So that worked out well. And there were other things that we were doing. Congress, for example, was very jaded about the testimony that was being given by CIA officers in closed session about highly sensitive operations. And the attitude, very clearly, I don't, among friends here, but I don't advertise it, but the attitude was, what are you going to lie about to us today? And the problem with some of the people, I won't name them, I could name them, but who were dedicated Americans, but they walked into a cold room in a closed session, like as if this were a closed session of the Congress on secret matters, and looked around and said, who are all these gargoyles sitting around? I don't know who they are. I know who the leaders are. I know who the members of Congress are, but who are these people? They're asking very sensitive questions that involve national security. I don't want to be talking about this. So they had various approaches. One of them, they'd dance around, be cute about it. Not to worry. Others would say, I don't have an answer to that question. And so we came up with a new approach. I just had a weekend with one of my favorite people, Bill Baker, on the West Coast, who contributed a lot to building this confidence back where it belongs. And with his help, we created what was called the 4 C's. All testimony before the Congress must be correct, candid, complete, and consistent. Don't say you don't have an answer because you don't want to answer it. Sure, you don't know who those people are. Respect that. You don't have to give the answer if you think it's wrong to give it, but don't tell them you don't have an answer. Say you have an answer, you're not authorized to give it, you'll take the answer back to headquarters, and headquarters will work with the congressional staff And believe me, it worked. The criticism, the suspicion that we were lying just seemed to disappear at that point. I never encountered it again. And it was a way of working with the Congress to make sensible solutions and a respect to the Congress's right to know information within their area of responsibility. We kept having to balance that and work it out, but you needed to have mutual respect, and I think that went a long way toward rebuilding confidence in what we were telling them, and that we would give them the information they needed, but we needed to work it out. As I said, if we couldn't do it with those gargoyles in the room, we do it with others who weren't in the room who we could give it to. So that's the kind of the effort to continue to work that way successfully. And we had, and I think that criticism that came out of the Iran Conference just dried up, and we didn't have to live with it after that.
We both have watched, obviously, the growth of the terrorist challenge to the United States, and I mean, you had to deal with it back in the 70s and moving on and transforming some of the ways that that the FBI did business, and then ultimately coming to CIA, and then we established the Counterterrorism Center, as you mean, and for somebody from FBI who wasn't supposed to understand how FBI worked, you did a superb job, I think, of helping to make that center a very effective unit for the U.S. government. But a related question that I have wondered about is this issue that comes up every time we have a terrorist attack. I remember when I was at the Bureau, the terrorist attack, the Boston bomber attack with the Tsarnaev brothers. Immediately there's a clamor in our society that we should send them directly to Guantanamo. The federal court system can't handle this. But then when I look at Moussaoui from the 9/11 period, the Eastern District of Virginia, in my judgment, did an excellent job of that. And then the Tsarnaev brothers, it did end up in the federal courts. So as an observer, not an expert as you are, it seems to me the federal courts are quite capable of handling terrorist incidents. Do you have and by the way, the most recent case was about 3 weeks ago with the terrorist incident in New York, where the president for a short time said, I'm considering sending him to Gitmo, and the perception is, well, they can do it faster, they can deliver justice quicker, and they don't all the legal ramifications of our judicial system, which protects people's liberties, should not apply in the case of these terrorists. But the fact is, if you look at the actual performance of Gitmo versus federal courts, I'm on the side of federal courts for doing it more thoroughly, efficiently, and effectively. So that's so you can disagree?
I don't have the statistics on efficiency, but my natural inclination after 8 years on the federal bench was that this is a good place where we can give them due justice, but give them justice and get a fair trial for the American people. And I think we should hesitate before we try to abandon it by sending it to some far-off place. The Gitmo thing, I can understand the appeal. Get them out of here because they're just going to make trouble and so forth. I had an experience as a naval officer. I was executive officer of a tanker I called back during the Korean War for 2 more years after World War II. And they didn't have enough lawyers, so they'd find out I was a lawyer and they'd snag me to sit on them. And too often I heard the term, you'd say he hasn't made his case. You'd hear the court martial, you'd say he hasn't made his case. And then I would hear, but you know what the old man wants. You know, that was an obvious reference to the commanding officer, and that the commanding officer wasn't going to be satisfied with a finding of not proven, not guilty, and so on. That worried me, and it continues to worry me. There's too much, and I think to create an atmosphere in which you say this is a place where they run things and you don't get a fair trial, and this is a place where things don't happen right, it will undermine your confidence in the justice system. But I agree with you, John. I think the capabilities of our courts to deal with this and deal with it fairly is one we ought to foster and not try to cast doubt about
These
it.
are the Article 3 courts. Right, absolutely. Hey, I want to turn to you folks. I'm going to pull it back occasionally if I can. I have some more questions I'd love to ask, but I want to get everybody engaged here. So let's go to the audience. And yes, are we going to have a microphone or? Hey, no, it's coming. It's coming.
I listened to you both speak, and I just feel like, are there other people out there in our government that are quality still?
I can't hear, but
I think we need the microphone because actually the rest of the audience can't. I can hear you, but you can't be heard part of it. Could you just?
I've lost faith, and I'm asking if there are other people in the government now that are working that are of quality like both of you.
Well, Fernando, you want to stand up? It's my buddy Fernando Cruz, who's working in the National Security Council, doing a great job. Of course, the answer is yes to that question. You know, there's a flip side to that. Are there some others who aren't, you know, working up to the expectations we hope we have? That's probably true too. But if you wanted to elaborate and be more specific about that, we'd be happy to take her. Yeah, David, over here. David Rubenstein.
Thank you, but a different David Rubenstein. I do want to ask you about the flip side of that question, which is, what kind of long-term damage to our institutions do you think could be done if, say, I'm not saying it's the case now, but if there were a president, say, who did not really press publicly for the rule of law and suggested that one man who's elected by the people should make the choices without regard to such things as laws? What kind of damage could be done long term?
I couldn't understand the question.
What kind? Unfortunately, it's a very clear question. He's asking what damage could the executive branch or a president do if he did not was not committed to the rule of law over time?
Well, over time, you just look at the history of democracies like Germany that became fascist, like Italy, others went through where the respect for the rule of law was turned upside down. I think I could give you other examples of this, but I'd like us to not shift gears, but move into something I hope would come up in discussion about some of the things that we ask our servicemen or our people in our organizations, our FBI and CIA, to do in support of our activities to combat terrorism and to combat some of the other things that threaten our government. And I just wanted to put in a word of reassurance about the procedures that are already in place and are being faithfully followed. One of those is called covert action. I'm sure all of you have heard that term before, and it's utilized especially in cases where we are trying to get inside organizations that are breaking the law or threatening our national security, and to interdict the people who are responsible for the breaking out of some of these terrorist activities we're experiencing. And that process is called covert action. It may involve something as harmless in a way to the public as underwriting the publication of a book about the four freedoms or about the other activities about our Constitution, which worked very successfully at the end of World War II to countries that were trying to learn how to build their country. They didn't say, this is a government plant here, we're giving you this as a covert action. How is covert action managed and controlled? That's what the important question I'm getting to. Covert action comes about when the president and his intimate leaders have determined that they're not able to succeed in formulating an attack, a covert attack, whatever it might be, as they had hoped, and they were not as successful in getting there because they had issues on how to put it together. At that point, the president would ask the director of the FBI or the director of Central Intelligence to come up with a plan of covert action, something that would involve doing things secretly or undercover or under different propositions. That would worry the average American who believed in a democratic process if he didn't know it was being managed appropriately. All I just wanted to say, because most of you don't know how this works, is that the president then issues a request to come up with a program, a plan for him to consider. And he does this by calling together the people who would be responsible for it. They go through an exercise in which they ask themselves, is this legal? Can we legally do this? Or what would it take, what orders would it take to make what we're proposing to do legal? Is it financially feasible? And the usual practical questions, is this going to work? If we're going to do this, we're going to have to pull the wool over some eyes here. Is it consistent with our process? Can we make it happen? And if we can make it happen, when it's all over, and this is the question I used to insist that we ask at the end of all these questions while they cross-examined each other, will it make sense to the American people when it becomes public? Because it always seems to do that. And that's the process. Then, when we put the package together, the whole national security community is called to the White House, and in the closed sessions, it's laid out what they propose to do. And they can ask any questions that they want to. And then the president is there, and the president hears the arguments, pro and con, and then the president makes a decision. If he wants to go forward with it, he issues something called a finding. And that finding is supplied to the Congress. It isn't asking them, can we do this? It's telling them, this is what we're going to do. And that finding must be furnished within 48 hours after the finding has been signed by the president, so that they get an opportunity to have their ways of trying to adjust or question or ask, so forth. But that's the way it works, and a highly secret process can be very successful if managed that way, with proper preparation beforehand and with exposing it to the security people at the White House in closed sessions. We get to something called covert action. And in my mind, as long as it's faithfully followed according to the rules that we've put together, it does a great deal we do in doing a lot of things that we could get completely sabotaged if it were tried to do it in a public arena. And we're responsible for it, and we're accountable for it. And we're not giving up on accountability. Accountability is part of the rule of law. The public is entitled to know at the appropriate time. Even on some of the other incidents that we've talked about in connection with some of the things we're doing, the Fort Hood massacre, when Nidal Hassan killed so many people, and we went after the problems there. They appointed the then head of the FBI was Robert Mullen at that time, same Bob Mullen. Bob Mullen asked me to head the commission, which I did. I had 5 other commissioners, all of whom had worked closely with me at one time or another and had distinguished themselves as lawyers and as thoughtful people. And that system worked effectively. I was just looking at it this day before I came down here. It's been so long since I looked at the report that was called the Webster Commission. And the Webster report was about 135 pages of recommendations of what we shouldn't repeat, what we should do, and how to deal with these issues on a sensitive basis in connection with what went wrong with the Fort Hood massacre. And I feel good knowing that we know we have to do it this way. It's the right way to do it. It's the effective way, and in the long run, it's going to be more successful, and we can deal with these terrorist events in a way that doesn't offend somebody. Doesn't mean we're not going to get into a lot of these discussions that you're reading about in the newspapers today, but I'm talking about serious threats. CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies, has a whole section referred to transnational threats, and they have to have ways to deal with them, to understand the issues, and to make sure they're done in a proper way. I think that's what maybe separates us from many other countries in the world. We care about these things, and they make us difference between what we are and what we could become if we didn't manage our work accordingly.
I would just add to that, I mean, to your question, David, that I know enough about what are the capabilities of CIA today and the FBI and Defense Intelligence Agency, and I think there are, in terms of the national security challenges that Judge Webster is talking about, I think we have strong capabilities that are fully engaged by people that are committed to doing their jobs with total integrity and professional commitment. I mean, to your question about, if you keep doing the wrong thing for a long time, obviously bad things happen. But to the extent to which I think our courts, for example, I think are continuing to function in a way that are preventing a lot of things from happening because they are committed, I think, to the rule of law, should be encouraging to us. And some of us are old enough to have lived through periods like the McCarthy period, for example, the tremendous divisiveness of the Vietnam War period. We came through all that, and we came through it all, I think, partly because it wasn't deep state problems. It was people really committed in these institutions to the right thing to do, to the professional thing to do, to the rule of law. I think that is very much there, and I think in the larger sense, there's always, for people who are concerned, and there's always the opportunity to mobilize and to motivate and to get ready for midterm elections. I mean, so our system is pretty well set up to deal with the crisis. And by the way, when people talk about challenges, in all the years that I worked in the intelligence business, I thought I was working for a country that had come through, had defeated Nazi Germany, ultimately defeated the Soviet Union with all the threat that it represented to us, and had the strength, institutional strength, to be able to deal with all these things. And when it did go, I mean, when we were talking about FBI and the COINTEL program, that was not a good period. But it was brought back to a very healthy center of commitment to the rule of law by people and institutions that are strong and have tremendous resiliency to them. So that's why I personally am not, I'm disappointed by some of the things I hear and see today, but I am not discouraged about the ultimate success of our institutions to be able to deal with them. And I mean that sincerely. But I do believe, by the way, for my friends who simply want to observe and whine about what they don't like to see, democracy does demand participation of people who want to take the tiller and get it back in that healthy center that I think has been the success of our country. Yes, Katie.
I don't know if this is on. Now it's on. So in the beginning you spoke about being part of the CIA and the intelligence community as Poland and Hungary and the former Soviet states fell and became democracies. And sorry that I'm totally changing the topic, but in recent years, especially with Viktor Orban in Hungary and other, I mean, obviously Putin in Russia, with that backsliding, I just wondered if you could comment a little bit on what it's like to have seen it all come crashing down and to see it starting to come back up again, and how that might pose challenges for us into the future as the United States.
On that, I had the privilege of being, when I was working for Judge Webster, to be a director for Europe, and at a time of tremendous transition in the late 80s. And I think if you look at Europe today, it would have disappointed a lot of the people. If you had Pope John Paul, for example, if he was still around, he would tell you he was very disappointed in his direct involvement in supporting Solidarity and trying to overthrow the Jaruzelski government, or certainly defeat the Jaruzelski government. He believed that he would be freeing up Poland for return to vibrant Christianity. And what we got was a return to vibrant materialism and Western-oriented consumerism. So he would be disappointed there. So if you look around Europe today, in Hungary, so Hungary is, in Viktor Orban, it isn't anything new there. It is essentially the old Eastern European anti-Semitism, resistance to immigrants, a nasty extreme right government in power and actually a country of good, decent people. But you had there, for example, with the refugee issues, you had Pope Francis who said, in Europe you will all take refugees into all the parishes of Europe. The Catholic cardinal in Hungary said, I don't agree with the Pope, I'm with Orban, the Pope is wrong. And you saw a tremendous right-wing swing. Poland today, by the way, is the Kaczynski government there is also rightist in an ugly way. But you also see, because of the investment in democracy in that country, you're seeing a very strong opposition grow to it. The European Union, which Hungary is a member of, is able to contain some of the negative aspects that Orban represents. And by the way, if you go back, a year ago, a lot of everybody in the United States, not everybody, but certainly a lot of our media, they were panicking about France because Le Pen has a really good chance of winning. Well, it was pretty clear that the established parties were mobilizing and organizing against Le Pen. And now we have Emmanuel Macron, who's this amazing 39-year-old guy. He looks like a Washington U graduate. I mean, who is actually taking on the mantle, really, of global leadership. And he working with Angela Merkel in Germany, who, by the way, 8 months ago, we were saying because of the refugee crisis and the very principled position she took, coming from East Germany herself and having been understanding what refugee life is like at the end of the war, she was committed to helping the refugees, and she brought 1 million refugees into Germany. Tremendous political discontent developed there. She won re-election. She's having a heck of a time getting a coalition together. That's democracy. But again, the democratic institutions actually have been strengthened by the pressure. The European Union has a lot of challenges today, but I think it is our interest in, and by the way, Merkel and Macron have just within the European Union configuration taken up the responsibility for funding the Paris Accords on climate change commitment that we forfeited by withdrawing from it. So our withdrawal from world engagement, I think, is hurting us, but the Europeans are doing okay. So I don't think Viktor Orban is a nasty leader representing old, discredited values, but it is not spreading around Europe. We saw in the Netherlands, by the way, the same thing where the organized parties circumvented a strong right wing, and the right wing in the European context doesn't mean extreme conservatism. It means nasty, a much nastier kind of version of that political movement. So I think encouraging. And I'm just saying, watch Macron. I mean, Macron came in and he immediately took steps to reform the French economy, to make it less protectionist in a way that his popularity went way down, but he did it smartly at the beginning of a 5-year term, so he's going to be able to work his way out of that. So it's not old Europe there. I think we should be encouraged by what we're seeing, and we should want to ally ourselves. Like I can talk about Asia in another context, but I think what is happening there too, there are some very good things there that we should want to be attached to, and I personally regret that we're not a part of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, because I think clearly that would have benefited the United States. But I don't think that this is the end of the game here. I think for the United States, I think we can always change our minds, and we can help change the minds of our leaders by at the same time sometimes changing the leaders. But yes.
Hi, I guess this is on. What really is Gitmo? Why do the Americans have this general perception that that is a little bastion out there somewhere where we send people and that place operates outside the rule of law? I mean, Obama wanted to close that. And
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question. Could you rephrase it?
I mean, recently there was a terrorist action, and President Trump said, "Send them to Gitmo." And I have at least the impression that that is someplace that operates outside the rule of law, as opposed to within the rule of law. So what?
It operates within military law, not within, right, federal.
Yeah.
Right. So what is the question?
Well, what really goes on there? And can you even answer that?
Well, I mean, I would turn to the judge for the judicial representative, but I think within a military structure, I think it is always true that what the military command wants is reflected in that system. And our federal system is much more oriented towards the rule of law for the protection of the individual rights. It is a different legal system and a different approach. But theoretically, I think the attraction to the Gitmo formula is that it appears to be swift, that you can get swift justice, and then that tends to reflect on the federal system, which is said to be less swift and less capable of delivering justice. I think what we have both argued here is the federal system actually is quite capable of delivering justice thoroughly and effectively. I don't know, Judge, if you want to add to that at all, but you're right that there is that appeal. It is different. I did when I was in the Navy for 23 years. I mean, and I know if you sent somebody we actually had on board judicial system but basically it's a command directed system. So individual rights and having legal representation that is of the same quality as you would get in a federal system is not there. It's a military system, is what it comes down. Yes.
Oh, sorry. They already gave me this.
Okay. She's got the power. She got the microphone. We'll get to you.
Very good. My question focuses internally and it's CONUS focused and the balancing of the rule of law with domestic terrorism. And is there any time in your experience where you see that balance of balancing the rule of law first has prevented you or even possibly the administration we have now from preventing acts of domestic terrorism because they're prioritizing citizens' rights and citizens' benefits?
Do you want to take that on?
I didn't understand.
Okay.
Sure. We have rights as citizens, and many times there are some, if you're reading the...
So are you talking about the trade-off between security and liberty, in a sense,
Exactly.
and freedoms?
There are many people who believe that trade-off right now, balancing, as we're calling the rule of law, is actually stopping us from preventing things like Vegas, which is fairly recent for everyone. And how do you actually how do you or people in those roles now balance that?
I think the best way I have seen it articulated is that we want security that protects freedoms. So that even if we have to, and the judge, I think, you're famous for having said that people want freedom over security until there's a major security incident, and then they want security, and that is true. And I think in our society we have certainly World War II with the internment of the Japanese, and those are terrible examples of excessive abuse. But we got back, and I think again the approach is that we want to preserve the constitutional freedoms, and the instructions. The instructions I always felt at CIA were: you look at the constitutional freedoms and how do we use security to protect them, and if you have to forfeit any freedoms for a given time, it has to be specified in law. You have to be able to get back to the freedoms. That it's always a risk that we can swing again in the midst of a crisis. But that's why I think people working in the intelligence community have felt so strongly that we needed to defeat ISIS, we needed to defeat terrorism, so that those questions don't really become more pronounced. Because if you have constant domestic terrorism attacks, people are going to be willing to give up their freedoms. So you've got to have intelligence services that are working to get at the root causes of terrorism and the people, the perpetrators of terrorism, and remove them from the threat that they represent, in order to allow the freedoms of freedom-loving and civically responsible people to proceed. Do you want to go ahead, Judge?
Could I add just a little bit to that? During times when people are not feeling really threatened, they tend to, many people, not every people, they tend to resist and resent the intrusion in their privacy. They're feeling that they're searched at airplanes, there are other things that are going on, and they're annoyed by restrictions that they have to go through in the interest of particular. They should know better by now, but I got a little bit of reputation, for good or bad, for having tried to make the point that said security is always, in the minds of private citizens, too much. It's always too much until the day it's not enough. And that's the responsibility of government, to behave responsibly in doing what we can legally do to protect our citizens from the risks that are inherent in certain kinds of activities, where you want to fly in freedom, you want to feel comfortable on the airplane, you want to do other things without expecting that something will go wrong, but that you'll be properly protected. And we try to minimize these restrictions to the point where they are not an unreasonable encroachment upon the civil liberties as such.
Tim?
Judge and John, thank you for a great session. It seems to me, though, the last few months, the events that really stood out in terms of terrorism were Las Vegas and Texas, not the New York thing. Do you think there's a convergence in what we call terrorism? You notice how quick the president was on Twitter about the terrorists in New York, but not the terrorists in Las Vegas and Texas and now in Northern California. Are we now just dealing, understand they're all going to have different causes, and whether there's a foreign entity in line with it, to me the end result is the same. It's an assault on our liberties and our way of life, whether it's a lone person in Las Vegas or whether it's some lone person in New York City, that are both fighting their own demons. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Did you want to?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd say if you run numbers, I mean, we've had a terrorist threat from white supremacists in parts of our country that FBI has been working on now for 2 generations, and it tends to get pushed aside, and we look for Muslims everywhere as opposed to the terrorists who, in fact, are not Muslims, and many of them go under a nominal Christian. I mean, Ku Klux Klan is Christian by its own definition. So are a lot of the white supremacists. So it's the domestic threat for causes that have nothing to do with the international terrorism is very much there. And I have to say that it's an issue of it's a combination of factors. In the access to guns is certainly one of the issues that I personally believe I think we have to deal with, because what I see it as threatening to our law enforcement officers who are outgunned by these terrorists who, the people who are supposed to protect us should have the support of the people who get protected. And when we send law enforcement out to deal with people who are enabled to outgun our law enforcement people, it's very dangerous. And what happened in Las Vegas is, I think anybody who, I have grandchildren, and what you see there is the happenstance. You saw it in Sutherland Springs in Texas. Good, decent people living life in the freedoms that we cherish in this country, who are gunned down. I think we do have to do better than we have done, but it's a combination of factors. Sure, it is mental health is a part of it, but I think the easy access to firearms and automatic weapons, I mean, that really don't seem, in my judgment, to have any place in society, has to be dealt with. And by the way, most gun owners that I know agree with me. So it isn't Second Amendment people versus Second Amendment. It's probably more complicated and more simple than that. I think gun manufacturers have a position that a lot of gun owners don't adhere to. I mean, I fully recognize it, and there are cultures in West Virginia and other places, where guns are a part of a culture in a way that they're handled responsibly. And I think it's possible to legislate in a way that doesn't threaten those people, but it does protect the rest of us and our children and grandchildren. And if I were one of those parents who lost a child or a mother or a grandmother, as was the case in Sutherland Springs, I would be. I mean, we're in a country where we guarantee the right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and we didn't guarantee their lives. This is something that we've got to deal with. Okay, well, just one more question, because I'm told if you keep asking questions, you can't have any dessert.
Just a really quick question. It's more about leadership, but balancing civil liberties with national security. Which leaders from American history or across the world do you think we can study and learn from? Because it's a delicate balance that you need in a society for society to have a rule of law. So where do we start for sources of law for this kind of leadership?
Judge, you want to?
That's a tough question to answer without some thoughtful thinking how you want to approach it. But I do think it's important that we be able to demonstrate and have a process for demonstrating that the steps that we take are fully sanctioned by the Constitution of the United States. And that's what we have, a court system and a Supreme Court that makes helpful judgments to us from time to time. There are to identify the appropriate limitations on freedoms that we're trying to guarantee. For instance, freedom of speech says Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of speech. But the Supreme Court has held in that connection that does not include the right to cry fire in a crowded theater. And we give the guidance to our leaders to follow those restrictions, and we respect the restrictions that are given to us by statute and by the Constitution. You're going to find people who would like to go back to the good old days. You'd like to have people who like to abolish all weapons under any circumstances, despite the Second Amendment. We have to have people living with those issues and clearly defining the results of the contest that we make to decide that. I think there's a broader question, and I call it the question of trust. From time to time, I do talk about trust. We have trust as something that isn't automatically given to someone just because they've been elected. They have to continue to earn it by demonstrating their own respect for the rules and their willingness to be energetic in enforcing the rules that need to be enforced in order to keep the society what it is. But if we stop trusting someone because of something they do or don't do that is outside the bounds, we better do something about it. And we're going through some debates right now that make me wonder whether or not we are not really focusing as we should be focusing on getting truth before the American people and asking the hard questions to arrive at good, sound decisions that we can support as citizens of the United States. Leadership is at the forefront, But I think at the success of a good leader is going to depend on whether he is trustworthy or not in what he's trying to do. He might make mistakes, but they're going to be honest mistakes, and they're going to be mistakes that can be corrected. Having said all of that, I think we're about run out of excuses for where we are. Thank you.